Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome in to another new episode of The Lager Line, served to you as always courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm your host, Ben DuBose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire and a contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. Joined on this early August day as the NBA's offseason turns to, I suppose, the proverbial dog days. To help get through it, I'm joined by Paulo Alves, my co-host and producer, good friend out of Portugal. Paulo, how's it going? How are you surviving these 3 months or so without NBA activity?
Well, it's tough because last year I was surviving it through vicariously living through Jeremy Pena, and now he sucks, I guess, so I'm kind of sad.
That's harsh. He did go to the White House today and was asked to raise his hand by President Biden, of course, referring to winning MVP of the LCS and the World Series. But that's, of course, a tribute to 2022. It's not based on his 2023. We should note, though, that towards the end of 2022, he went through some scuffles over the summer, and then it was late August, September that he made some changes to his approach at the plate. And then, of course, it really took off the last couple of weeks in the regular season and throughout October. So hopefully history repeats itself and he gets ready for another run in October, which coincides with the opening of the 2023-24 Houston Rockets season. So that's sort of the glass half full view, is that, you know, the Astros have had a lot of things go wrong, Pena's regression, all the injuries, and yet they're still within a couple of games of the Rangers in great shape as it pertains to the wild card standings. So October should be a fun month, obviously for the Rockets. That's what we talked about here, but for the Astros as well. It's a good time to be a Houston sports fan, right?
Yeah, it's just depressing to go on, you know, I've been taught by everybody on baseball Twitter that all I have to do to determine if someone's good or not is go on Baseball Savant and see how red the little balls are. And his are mostly blue. Someone make the joke about blue balls. So it's not it's not going well, but at the very least Altuve and Jordan are back, so I guess it's kind of fun again in a way. And now apparently Chas McCormick's also really good, which he was already last season, but he was kind of an underdog back then. I don't know. It's been more and more fun, obviously, with them trading for JV again. It gives more of an incentive to watch at the very least, like once every 6 days. So
yeah, and perhaps he can get going. I know everyone is down on Jeremy Pena because he's just been bad as a hitter this year. Let's just be honest. But there's been a lot of talk recently. Should they bat him second? Of course, that's where he was during the postseason run last October. And when he's struggling like this and you're batting him second high in the order and getting so many bats in the game, it's brutal. But if you dig down into the numbers, he actually does bat, even with the recent struggles, substantially better at number 2. I think that's because he's got protection on both sides with Altuve in front of him and Jordan or Kyle Tucker right behind him. So it's tough to really pitch around him in those circumstances. You have to throw him a lot more strikes that he can do something with, be it a fastball or a breaking ball. It's easier for him to predict at least where it's going to be because he knows they're not going to risk walking him at that spot in the order. And so I think that placement would be a lot easier to stomach if you have a deeper lineup overall. So if they can get Jose Abreu going again, Chas McCormick can sustain what he did in July, they're calling up John Singleton for tomorrow's game, then ultimately I do think the 2 spot is better for Pena. It's just about whether the lineup as a whole is deep enough to sort of survive that. And to spin it back to basketball, so John Singleton, who they're bringing up, I know this predates your Astros fandom, but he was a top prospect in 2013, 2014, ended up washing out of the league entirely, had multiple drug suspensions, I believe, related to weed, although don't quote me on that. I have to go back and look at the particulars. Basically was out of baseball for 4 years, and now in his 30s has basically had a late career renaissance, got back into the minor leagues, hit at an extraordinary level with the Astros AAA affiliate, the Sugarland Space Cowboys, and now he's back, and maybe he's going to be a part of lengthening that lineup. He'll either play at first base or as designated hitter. But it's so bizarre. Like, I think back to basically 10 years ago, he was a top prospect, and somehow he went out of the league entirely, and now he's back as a potential contributor, even a starter in a number of games. They definitely need a left-handed bat with some power. Don't have any of that on the bench because Michael Brantley has not been healthy enough to play all season long. I was thinking back to Rockets history. I guess the parallel would be, one of their top prospects in 2013, 2014 were guys like Terrence Jones, Donatas Motiejunas, who are largely at least out of the NBA. I know Motiejunas is still playing, I believe. That's basically what this is like. It's like bringing freaking Demo back to the Rockets. It's the most bizarre parallel. Let's see, what is Donatas Motiejunas doing right now?
He's
He is
probably playing in Europe.
Yes, he is playing in Lithuania. Or no, he's playing. No, he's from Lithuania, of course. He's playing in the French league, the top tier in France. So yeah, he is still playing. So congratulations, folks. If you've made it with us to this point, you know we're in the dog days of the NBA offseason because we're talking about Donatas Motiejunas, who has not played for the Rockets in many years, potentially having a late career John Singleton style renaissance. Not counting on that because, of course, the Rockets, as currently constructed, have all sorts of young prospects for Ime Udoka to choose between as he puts together his options for the rotation in this upcoming season and beyond. And as we transition to more serious NBA and Rockets analysis, look, even though we're in the dog days of the NBA calendar, as I mentioned leading off the pod, it's not like there's nothing going on. This is a World Cup year for FIBA basketball. And so there's a U.S. national team, which is going through its training camp in Las Vegas right now and over the past week. And there's also a U.S. select team, a group of young prospects that was brought out to training camp to play against the national team in scrimmages and practices. And potentially, if there's an injury or any other withdrawal from the national team, then someone from the select team could be promoted to the actual World Cup roster once games begin for the U.S. and every other country participating, I believe, towards the end of this month and then continuing into early to mid-September. That's part of the reason I believe the NBA is starting its training camps a bit later this year, as opposed to the last week of September, which is the way it's been the last couple of years. It's going to be the first week of October this year, and I think the World Cup is a reason for that. Anyway, the Rockets' connection to Team USA is with Jalen Green, who, as we mentioned on one of our recent pods, is on the select team, which at the moment does not position him to actually play in World Cup games, but it does have him competing against the best of the best against the national team. And there's a lot of benefits to be taken from that. I think first and foremost, iron sharpens iron. And so going up against the best of the best, elite competition, Anthony Edwards is on the national team, and everybody's talking about how, and honestly has for over a year now, wanting Jalen Green in Houston to take the Anthony Edwards leap that he did in Minnesota. Well, I can think of no better way for Jalen Green, the number 2 pick in 2021, to try and do that than regularly facing off with the guy he's so frequently compared to, the number 1 overall pick from a year earlier in 2020. And so in these select team versus national team matchups, then yeah, you see Jalen Green going up against a lot of elite guys, but most notably Anthony Edwards. And so you certainly hope that iron sharpens iron. And while it's not as if, if there was no select team, I suppose you can point out that it's not like he'd be sitting on his couch. There's pro-ams, there's gym runs, there's basketball camps. I believe Jalen's hosting his again in Fresno in the middle of this month. That's his hometown. So it's not like he would be doing nothing. But number one, you don't have the volume of elite competition that you do at a Team USA training camp. And secondly, at these pro-am type events, a lot of times you have guys that are going at 75, 80% to try and avoid getting hurt, as opposed to Team USA with a World Cup less than a month away. The stakes are raised. These guys are taking it seriously. And so you hope that as long as he's able to stay healthy, that it's going to put Jalen Green in the best physical form and hopefully mental form as well to feel confident and ready once NBA training camps open in early October. And the good news, while there have not been any statistics released, I think they guard those pretty closely in terms of the intra-squad scrimmages. There have been some reporters allowed into the gym to watch those practices and those scrimmages in recent days. And the reports I've seen are pretty positive for Jalen Green. Mark Jones of ESPN, this was the most notable one. Let me call up the quote right now. If I'm the Rockets, I'm thrilled with how Jalen Green is playing for the select team. He gave the varsity some work yesterday. Mark Jones reported that over the weekend, and there were other reports that said the select team actually beat the regular team on Friday, which was the first day of scrimmages. Now, I think that changed over the next couple of days, and the national team got wins over the select team. I think some of the more veteran-laden types probably took it a bit more seriously after Jalen, Cade Cunningham, Chet Holmgren, and the rest of those young guys that the select team is comprised of perhaps were a bit more ready than some of the veterans expected them to be on that first day of scrimmages on Friday. But the point is, according to Mark Jones, according to Joe Varden at The Athletic, who wrote that Jalen Green was very effective against Team USA, it sounds like things are going very well. So it's not just iron sharpening iron. While we don't have statistics because they keep those closely guarded, it's not like these are real games. These are people that are watching the games that are very credible, or the scrimmages, I should say, and reporting that Jalen Green is more than holding his own. And that's a very positive sign going up against the best of the best. And I think what's perhaps most noteworthy about it, it sounds as if Cade Cunningham is basically the engine of the select team. He's operating, even though he's not a full-blown point guard, he's basically their point guard. He's the guy initiating the offense. And so that's allowing Jalen to take on more of an off-ball role. And I think that's part of the case for optimism with Jalen this season with the Rockets. All this talk about, is he a winning player? The true shooting percentage is below 54, even though he put up more than 22 points per game last season, which easily led the Rockets. The raw data in terms of shooting percentages and then the advanced stuff like true shooting percentage, it was all fairly pedestrian. And you've seen these storylines of, is he a chucker? Is he ever going to contribute to winning by being able to channel it in a team construct? And we've made the case that a lot of it's simply because who else on Houston was going to take those shots? They haven't had a point guard over Jalen's first 2 years in the NBA. Kevin Porter Jr. has been sort of forced into that role, and he's also missed 20 plus games a year due to injury as well. And then when you go from year one to year two, they traded Christian Wood away in the offseason. They traded Eric Gordon away at the deadline. They got substantially younger with Jabari Smith Jr. basically taking Christian Wood's spot in the starting lineup, and then KJ Martin taking Eric Gordon's spot. So it's been an incredibly young team. It's been one that's had one of the worst records. And so it's forced Jalen Green to take on a role in terms of on-ball creation, and beyond that, just simply being the top guy that every opposing team has leading their scouting report. Every opposing defense is trying to stop Jalen Green because, quite frankly, hardly anyone else on the Rockets has posed much of a consistent threat at all other than Alperen Sengun. And of course, he's a interior player. So in terms of the perimeter attack of the Rockets, it's been Jalen Green drawing most of the coverages from opposing defenses. He's been leading those scouting reports, and that's a lot to ask of a 20-year-old in his second NBA season on one of the NBA's worst and one of its youngest teams. So in many ways, he's been set up to look inefficient. And the hope for him to take a leap, and now you've had this big offseason, you've brought in veterans, guys like Fred VanVleet, Dylan Brooks. You hope Kevin Porter Jr. can stay healthier next season and perhaps take a little bit of the load off of Jalen, let him do a bit more off ball, and by doing so, put him in opportunities that make him more efficient, that give him the window to do things in 2023 to 24 that he couldn't do last season. And there should be some growth anyway. I'll acknowledge that he's in his third NBA season and he's 21 years old now, so he should be getting better, as any prospect should at this point of his development. And there is going to come a point, we throw out these archetypes for him like Devin Booker, and yeah, at some point by year 5, year 6, year 7, just as Booker did, there needs to come a point in which even if Jalen Green is the headliner on the scouting report, he's still able to go out and give you 30 points per game on strong efficiency. If he's going to be the guy that we all wanted him to be when he was drafted number 2 overall in 2021, then at some point he's going to need to actually be able to handle that and not just thrive in an off-ball role. But that's something that may take years, and it has for players of his archetype over the last 5 to 10 years. And so there's no panic. I think what you want to see in the short term, can you get that efficiency up and let him gradually develop, as opposed to throwing him into the fire too quickly, potentially developing some bad habits and core confidence associated with that. I think at times we've seen that the last couple of years. I think the hope is that with a real point guard and Fred VanVleet and these veterans you brought in, that when you have him in an off-ball role, all of a sudden some of those efficiency metrics are going to pick up relative to the role he's had to take on the last couple of years. And so while it's a small sample for sure, I think seeing him flourish next to Cade Cunningham in an off-ball role, to me, it has me more optimistic that all these things we're talking about on paper as reasons to believe year 3 is going to be better for Jalen Green. It sounds like that it's actually translating to the court, and hopefully that continues in October, right?
We obviously have limited knowledge of what goes on. I was able to find basically the full game from the Friday's practice, and then I could only watch highlights of the rest of the practices that they held throughout the weekend. But I did watch the entirety of the Friday one. And well, first takeaway is he was guarded by Mikal Bridges. That was his primary matchup, which is, a good test, one of the best defenders in the league, 3 wing at that. But my first takeaway from it is he doesn't look smaller than Mikal Bridges, who's listed at 6'6". So we need the NBA to, go measure him again, because I'm sure he's not 6'4", as I'm sure that KPJ is not 6'4". That's more of a fan like a trigger thing. But come on, dude's not 6'4".
No.
That being said, my takeaway is a lot of the same stuff that you said. In the first game, Cade Cunningham was just cooking Tyrese Haliburton, cooking whoever was in front of him. He looks a lot bulkier than he did coming into the league, and he at the point guard position, it's just tough to stop. He's going to be stronger than most point guards out there, which led, as you said, to Jalen Green playing more off ball. And the main takeaway from it is just that it confirms what we've been saying on here for the better part of I'm not going to say the full year, but past the first third of the season, which is, at least for me, ideally Jalen Green has a little bit of a shot selection, or the split between off ball and on ball, and the way he's used off ball to what Steph Curry does. A lot of people like to bring up, Devin Booker. A lot of people bring up Zach LaVine, Bradley Beal, who early on, to his credit, when he played with John Wall, played a lot of off ball. But to me, you can use Jalen in a lot of those same ways that Steph Curry is used. He's obviously not as good of a shooter, but just the split. It's basically a 50-50 split in the reps that you do have designated for him, between him being on ball and him being off ball. In year 1, we saw a lot of encouraging things as far as him relocating and staying active even when he gives the ball up, which got lost in year 2. Well, I think some of it because the team just quit. I think there's an interview before the season even starts where Jalen's basically cautioning fans to, hey, we're probably not going to be good, and if you're going into the season with that expectation already, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did, because I bet that it also comes a little bit from higher up in the expectations that the front office and the coaching staff had for the season. Basically, he didn't showcase those same abilities year 2, and that's basically not what was asked of him either. And so, because of that, seeing him in this scenario where he's just surrounded by much better players than he was last season with the Rockets, and not just Cade Cunningham. Chet Holmgren was there, Jalen Duren was there, Trey Murphy was there. Guys that are, or not Chet because he hasn't played yet, but there's guys that are going to find success in the NBA this season. It showed how much easier the game is for him when you simplify it. Right, because he has all of the athletic tools. He has worked on his jump shot, which is a lot quicker now. Not that than it was in this last season, but when he came in very early on, he has like a lot of ease getting it off. And so if you can simplify the game for him as to he only has to make the decision whether if he's open, he's going to shoot. If he's not, he has the speed to blow by guys. And he's shown to be able to make the extra pass as well when he gets to the rim, and he's become more calculated at that. He has all the tools to be, one of the best off-ball players in the league, because it's just really tough to guard a guy that's that shifty with that much athleticism that's also able to shoot the ball. And so going into this season, hopefully we get back to, and I'm sure we will, because Ime Udoka played with Jaylen Brown, a guy that can get it off the dribble, but with his limited handle has to get a lot of reps just from sets. Hopefully Ime Udoka institutes a system where he is closer to that 50-50 split as far as on-ball, off-ball goes. And we saw a lot of that. We saw him make a lot of threes. We saw him catch alley-oops. We saw him going around screens, and he has, as we know, a really easy time if he and his defender are starting off from basically the same spot on getting a step on people and just finishing at the rim. And we saw, at least, he didn't get the biggest amount of usage, but in the small little tidbits that we saw him still be able to do that against great competition. And so to me, it just reiterates the point that he is more of a Steph Curry type of player than he is a James Harden or a CJ McCollum or something like that. And so hopefully that's something that we see going forward this season. And even if he didn't improve, if we changed his the way he's used a little bit, he would, I think, with the skill set that he had last season, would easily be league average true shooting wise, just by changing the shot diet. Because early last season, or throughout the entire season, he was, I would say, what, 60-40 maybe on ball, off ball.
Mm-hmm.
This last season, he was like 90-10, which is just a lot of responsibility. And, hopefully, and this is what we want as Rockets fans, obviously, and what we've been advocating for, with a point guard that, has averaged 7-8 assists a game throughout his career, with Alperen Sengun there, who, hopefully will be more featured with Ime Udoka. He can slot, or he can have more reps off the ball, which will increase his efficiency. And that you couple that with his, developed ability to get to the free throw line when he's playing on ball. And now, we're starting to see something. And in my opinion, if we're looking at this team for next year, if we want to make a playoff push, I think Jalen Green has to be the best player on this team. Maybe not the best overall player, but at least offensively, I think he has to be the best player on this team. I have trouble, picturing a team whose best player is Fred VanVleet, or even Operation Good making the playoffs, because, well, for Fred VanVleet, we saw him with the Raptors. He wasn't even the best player. He had Pascal Siakam, who is, an all-star, playing next to him, and OG Anunoby, and he still couldn't do it, or they couldn't do it last season. So I doubt that that's the path. But if we want to make the play-in or the playoffs, as I said, it's going to take a leap from Jalen, and I think it's both going to be mostly on the defensive end, where I think, just from a commitment standpoint, and actually caring about the result every single game and fighting for something, I think that will improve it from him, because he has the tools. We know he has the tools. We saw flashes of him stopping Donovan Mitchell in the clutch, and the guys like that. So I think most of the improvement will come on the defensive end, and then on the offensive end, I think you'll get to it at the very least league average, just as a product of better shot selection and actually having the offense somewhat tailored to what he's good at, rather than just throw him into the fire and hope he comes out on top.
Yeah, and I should mention, if any of our listeners want to track down footage, if you haven't watched it already, go to YouTube, go to Twitter, go to your social media platform of choice and search for Team USA, search for Jalen Green. You can go to Rockets Wire and look at the story that I put together on it. That's a compilation of highlights. They're not too difficult to find, both the full games as well as the select highlights of Jalen doing what he does. If you're really starved for basketball and you want to see what's going on out in Las Vegas with not just the national team, they are going to have some of their exhibitions in the coming days, including one tonight, televised, but also these practices, these scrimmages and stuff that actually involves members of the select team, most notably Jalen Green with your Houston Rockets. And really, it's so important, and it's why I led off the podcast discussing it, because this is a massive year for Jalen Green. And so to see growth from him, even in a small sample on some of those fronts, it's really encouraging, because honestly, it's needed. Some of the red flags surrounding his first couple of years, again, there are legitimate reasons for that in terms of the supporting cast, the way he was used, the lack of a competitive environment, the coaching staff, all of that is completely reasonable to say. But this year, the excuses run out. He's got to, I don't want to say be a finished product, because it's too soon for that at 21 years old, year 3, but he's got to be much more of a winning player, to use the I suppose, debate term that gets thrown out, at least on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it, all the time amongst NBA fans. This debate of, is Jalen Green a winning player? We should see some signs of it this year. I think we will, but ultimately it's time for Jalen, at least to an extent, to put up or shut up. And it sounds like to this point in Las Vegas, he's putting up, and hopefully that continues into training camp with the Rockets. And when I was putting together our agenda for the podcast, it got me to thinking about who this season is most important for, because it's not equal across the board. For starters, the Rockets do not have realistic ambitions to compete for a championship this season. Let's just be honest. It's still a young, rebuilding group, even if they're closer to the play-in mix and being competitive with guys like Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks leading the way and trying to teach the young guys like Jalen, like Alp, like Jabari Smith Jr., like Tari Eason, and so on and so forth, how to win. Ultimately, it's not going to be at a contending level just yet. So really, organizationally, in terms of 2, 3, 4 years down the road, when they actually do have a path to contention, the most important thing is going to be individual development, and especially from some of your young prospects. And Jalen is, at least from an investment cost, the top one you have, drafted number 2 overall in 2021. That's the highest pick that the Rockets accumulated in this tanking window. And so, of course, there's a lot of interest in him. And yeah, it led me to think about, who is this season most important for? And I put together a list of my top 5. I'm going to go through mine, and then Paulo, you can do the same. I'm sure there may be some overlap. I'm guessing there's going to be some differences as well. I'll say for me, the criteria I used, I don't think it's an especially big season for your super veterans. Think Fred VanVleet, Jeff Green, because those guys largely are what they are. Sure, you want to see, in Fred's case in particular, that there's not some huge regression, that he lives up to the contract. But look, he's spent nearly a decade in the league. He's won a championship. He makes a huge impact defensively. He's a good shooter when the shot diet, the shot profile is right. We know who Fred is. We know who Jeff Green is. Conversely, I don't think it's all that important of a year for Amin Thompson and Cam Whitmore, simply because they're not likely to have super huge roles immediately. And so whether they're really good, like Scotty Barnes a couple of years ago, or they're just not quite ready, at the end of the day, who they are as rookies isn't going to have that much of a correlation with what their end outcome is likely to be. Sure, I still want to see them play. I still want to see some flashes, but I don't have them near the front of my list for this being a huge season in terms of their career trajectory, just because no matter what they do, I don't think I'm going to leave this season finishing or feeling dramatically different about who they're going to be or who they're capable of being at the NBA level. And then with guys like Fred and Jeff, well, I certainly hope I'm not. I'm not ruling it out, because it could be this is the year that Jeff Green finally falls off a cliff. Maybe Fred isn't as good with the infrastructure in Houston as he was with the team in Toronto that, as you mentioned, Paulo, had a few more veteran difference makers like Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby. But at the end of the day, I feel like I know who those guys are. And there's a reason the Rockets signed them, in Fred's case in particular, to the deals they did. They're fairly well established. So when I look at this season being maybe make or break is too strong, but very important to the player and their long-term trajectory, my list is much more tilted towards the young guys with the asterisk of not the rookies, guys who are a bit more advanced in their development, and thus it's more realistic to see something of a leap, if not in their overall game, at least in components of their game. So I'll start with my list. This is going to be slightly different from the criteria that I just laid out. But at number 5, I actually have Dylan Brooks. I know he's 27. I know he's something of a veteran, but unlike Fred, there are some concerns, or at least it's been reported that there are. We know the dialogue and the discourse surrounding Dylan on social media about the antics, about the shot selection, about some of the things in Memphis that led to him not getting all the recognition that he earned by being one of the league's best perimeter defenders every single year, and a guy who is definitely a capable 3-point shooter. This is not Corey Brewer, a guy who certainly has the athleticism to be a pesky defender and can make some plays defensively, but just doesn't have the ability to shoot. No, Dillon can absolutely be a good shooter in the NBA. The issues with his percentages are related to the shot selection. And so with Dillon transitioning from the Grizzlies, a team that's been near the top of the Western Conference the last few years, to a team in the Rockets that's been near the bottom of the West, look, there are some people that are going to, and I've already seen this question raised, they're going to point out, if Dillon couldn't corral and stay on top of these issues with the Grizzlies in a competitive environment where you have established alphas in place like John Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr., although we should point out, of course, that in the case of John Morant, he was not available for much of the second half of this season. And I think maybe that played into some of the antics we saw from Dillon Brooks. I've seen it hypothesized that maybe some of the things Dillon did was as somewhat of a cover to distract, to keep the focus away from John Morant and all the things he was dealing with off the court during the second half of last season. Nonetheless, it is fair to ask, look, if Dillon has these issues for a very good team like the Grizzlies, that's in a super competitive environment where every margin is put under the spotlight and they're trying to win every game, what happens in Houston where they don't have ambitions, at least in the next year or two, of winning a title? The stakes are not that high. There's not really an established alpha in place, at least not to the extent of John Morant before things started to go haywire in terms of the guns and the social media concerns and whatnot. Is he going to revert back to those habits or perhaps even accelerate some of them? I personally don't expect that to happen. Again, the reporting this offseason has indicated that Dillon was a priority target for Ime Udoka in particular, who carries a lot of weight, his name that is, in NBA circles. And I think he has the type of presence that, unlike Stephen Silas, I'd be very concerned about bringing Dillon Brooks into a Stephen Silas locker room. I think Ime Udoka carries enough respect from NBA players that it's going to be a little bit easier for him to relate to Dillon and hopefully get him to buy in on everything the Rockets need from him, not just in terms of production on the court, defense, taking the right threes and not getting too carried away with the shot profile, but also in terms of keeping the antics in check. Some of them are good. I think that every team can benefit from a Pat Beverly type that's willing to do the dirty work and occasionally try and get in an opponent's heads. But as with anything, you can do it a bit too much to the point where it can be a little bit of a distraction. So I think this year, if Dillon goes out and we don't hear nearly as much about the extracurricular, about the antics, then honestly, I think it's going to be really good for his long-term future with the Rockets because look, he's under contract for 4 years. They gave him more than $80 million. He's just 27 years old. It's entirely possible that Dillon Brooks is still a role player for you in 3-4 years when we hope the Rockets are seriously contending for an NBA championship. It's possible he's still there. So even though he's not a young player, it's highly possible that Dillon is still around and in the prime of his career when you're trying to win at the highest level. And yet there are reasons why literally no one expected him to go back to the Grizzlies once free agency began this offseason. He did wear out his welcome. And while you can have optimism that with Ime Udoka and a new environment in Houston that things are going to be different, at the same time, he needs to show it. So while it's not necessarily a big year for Dillon from the standpoint of developing his game, I think we know what his skills are at the NBA level and what he needs to focus on. I do think if he has a productive year without a ton of, let's call it extracurricular activity, then that's going to go a long way towards making Rockets fans feel like, hey, this is a guy who the team was justified in signing for 4 years and someone that hopefully can be a quality 3-and-D type role player for the Rockets over the coming decade as they try and transition to consistent contention. So he's number 5 on my list. Number 4, the rest of the way, these are going to be your younger guys. I've got Jabari Smith Jr. at 4 because I think Jabari has some clear momentum right now. We know how his rookie season started. It was really bad. But the second half of the year, we did see some growth in a number of areas. He had the game winner against the Pelicans. And now he went into the offseason. He made it a point to play in Summer League and looked absolutely brilliant. I think clearly would have been MVP had he continued to play with the Summer League team. And it's hard to quantify, but there are certain points in the development of a young player where you can just feel the momentum and they need to build on that. this is more at like a team level, but think back to Devin Booker when the Suns went 8-0 in the bubble, nearly made the playoffs, but it felt like, okay, they found something. And so next year they add Chris Paul, and before you know it, oh, Devin Booker's a superstar, and the Suns are a perennial contender. Not saying it's going to happen that quickly for Jabari Smith Jr. or that his run the last few months, the way he concluded the season, and of course what he showed in summer league over the past month or so is anywhere near the extent of Devin Booker in the bubble. What I'm saying is that on a smaller scale, you hope that you can capitalize on this momentum. And with Jabari, look, expectations are higher, being the number 3 overall pick. I picked Jabari and not Tari for my list because, quite frankly, Tari has already shown enough in year one that we know Tari is going to be a good role player at the NBA level. Perhaps he turns into more than that, but he impacted winning already as a rookie. I feel pretty good about what he's going to be and what he can do. With Jabari, there were some clear highs. There were also some pretty low lows. And so with much of it, in my opinion, especially the shooting being a confidence thing, and I think him getting off on the wrong foot really held him back for a while. Conversely, now that he's had a run of good form and he's had some things go his way, then you want to see a guy who's still one of the youngest guys in his draft class at 20 years old. You want to see him build on what he did at the end of last season and in summer league and become something closer to, if not Paulo Banchero, definitely worthy of a top 3 pick in a decent 2022 first round. So while I'm not going to say that if Jabari doesn't take a leap in year 2 that he's a bust, at the same time, I do think that he's got clear momentum, and we've heard about him taking this offseason seriously in terms of yoga, adding strength. He had a great interview on the Brad and Will show last week talking about that. All the vibes around Jabari are positive. He's got a new coach in Ime Udoka who seems to have a clear plan for him. He talked about Ime putting him in different spots than Steven did, and that should benefit Jabari as well. We've also heard rumblings that Ime likes Jabari as a potential small ball 5. So I've got all these positive things. Can Jabari take advantage? That is a big storyline, even if at year 2, he's still relatively young in his sort of career trajectory. 3, I've got Alperen Sengun. The biggest reason, look, the 3rd season is big on a number of levels for first round NBA prospects in particular, because after year 3 is when teams oftentimes are forced to take stock of where a player is at in his development and how he fits into the long-term puzzle. Because it's after the 3rd season that you can offer contract extensions. Now, you don't have to offer contract extensions. You can take a player to restricted free agency after year 4. That's the 4th year of the 4-year contracts typically given out to first-round draft picks. But by and large, you want to at least have an idea by the end of year 3 as to what your first-round pick is or could be. And certainly, year 3, they should be a lot better than they were as a rookie. I think that's step 1. And both Jalen and Alp, in terms of the highly drafted 2021 guys, have done that to this point. You want to see them continue to improve. But also with Alp, look, there's clear deficiencies, especially on the defensive end. There's a reason why the Rockets prioritized Brook Lopez in the offseason. There's a reason why they talked about Ime in particular adding different types of bigs. They have concerns about his rim protection. And Paulo, you've talked about in our archives about how difficult it can be to build a contender without having a rim protector at the 5. I think that may be why you've heard some talk about potentially using Jabari Smith Jr. as somewhat of a lightweight 5, but someone who definitely has the length at 6'11", and then you could play Tari Eason at the 4, or even Cam Whitmore as the years progress. There's lots of options. And so with Sengun, we know what he can do as a playmaker. We know what he can do offensively, but can he continue to improve his 3-point shot? And can he become a passable defender? Can Ime Udoka find out how to best use him, be it in drop coverages or switching? And what matchups are right to pick out? What configurations in terms of the rotation and lineups are best to optimize Sengun, play to his strengths and minimize his weaknesses? We know that going into the offseason, they certainly didn't look at Alp as a guy that he's clearly 35 minutes per game and entrenched starter. No, there's a reason why they went after Brook Lopez. Unfortunately, they did not get him. But one of the silver linings is now you have no choice but to play Alperen Sengun. He's going to get some tough love from Ime Udoka, who stylistically should be a lot different in terms of the culture he sets relative to Stephen Silas. How does he respond? And ultimately, while it's not that the Rockets have to offer a contract extension to Sengun, to Jalen, to any of their extension eligible guys next offseason, you want to at least have a good idea, because at year 3, or I suppose going into year 4, if you're uncertain how a guy fits in, be it financially, basketball reasons, or a combination of the two, into your long-term puzzle, that may be the time to trade them at peak value, because the acquiring team would then have the remainder of their rookie deal and then full control over negotiations, restricted free agency, and what have you for their second contract, which is typically very team friendly based on the restricted free agency dynamic and how that holds down offers. We just saw that with Austin Reeves and the Lakers this summer. So I think the Rockets want to have a better idea of Alperen Sengun, his strengths, how much can they mitigate the weaknesses by next off season. And so I think because of those dynamics, this coming season is big for him. 2 on my list for a slightly different reason, Kevin Porter Jr. His contract is more set because obviously they got that 4-year deal with tons of team options prior to the season starting last year. He's a case of a guy who, after year 3, they did use the restricted free agency status, or the potential restricted free agency status, as leverage, and they got the best deal they ultimately could. And it was very team friendly. I think KPJ's baggage played into his willingness to take that. A contract with tons of year-to-year options. The Rockets have already picked up, obviously, the option for this coming season. That's staying in effect. And then by the end of 2024, the Rockets have to make a choice. By the end of this coming season, I should say, the Rockets have to make a choice by June 2024 of whether to pick up the next option on KPJ's contract, which is for 2 years. So that's a big decision for the Rockets. Do they want to keep him for 2 more years? I think this season's performance is obviously going to show whether that's worthwhile. And then for KPJ, obviously he's incentivized to try and continue to stay on the straight and narrow, continue to play well, and prove worthy of the Rockets picking up that option. So because of that, it's a big year for Kevin. Certainly the finances are obvious, but I think in terms of his career trajectory, look, we know why the Rockets got him for basically free in early 2021 from Cleveland. Despite the fact that he was super talented, you hear top players around the league, Kevin Durant, Damian Lillard, they all rave about KPJ's talent all the time. He was a first-round pick in 2019, and yet the Cavaliers gave him away for free. The concerns are real. The anger management issues are real. The soup throwing, all the off-court things that happened when he was with the Cavaliers, that's real. That doesn't just happen. It's not that common. Those issues are real. It's not they can't be overcome, but they're significant. And as recently as 19 months ago, we know what happened on New Year's Day 2022, when I know Christian Wood was the instigator of some of the chaos that day, but Kevin Porter Jr. was so frustrated that he literally drove out of Toyota Center at halftime. Not only did not return to the bench to even support his teammates, let alone play. I think Stephen Silas made it clear that he wasn't going to play based on how heated things got during halftime. But he was so out of control, the anger management got the best of him, that he literally drove home midway through a game, and the team felt they had to issue an internal suspension. Now, to KPJ's credit, since then, there haven't been any issues, at least not that I know of. It's largely been about the basketball. And when it's about the basketball, look, Kevin Porter Jr. may not be a great point guard, but his true shooting percentage from about mid-December onward last year, the last 35 or 40 games, was at 60% or slightly below. That's very good and very efficient for a 6'6" guard who can play multiple positions. He can shoot. His catch and shoot numbers from 3 the last couple of years are amongst the best of anybody in the league. The talent is there. He's got the length and athleticism to guard players of different positions. Talent has never been the issue. It's just been, putting largely the off-court considerations behind him. He also does need to stay healthier. It's not like he's had a chronic injury, but he's had a tendency the last couple of years to pick up just a few knickknacks here and there that have cost him 20 to 25 games a year. If he can play 70 plus, that'll go a lot further towards establishing his long-term value if the team feels like that he's going to be more reliable in terms of his availability. I do think he needs to show that. But I think the clear headliner is the off-court issues. He's come a long way. And while the question is out there with Jalen, we talked about earlier, is he a winning player? It's out there with KPJ too, but in a different way. With KPJ, it's not about the efficiency. The efficiency numbers are actually good. They're a decent bit better than Jalen, even though they're fairly similar archetypes in terms of how they play, their physical conditions, the way their bodies work, the positions they're going to occupy on a floor, and so on and so forth. With KPJ, it's more, can a team in a super competitive environment trust this guy to not make it about himself, to not have a relapse. And while the last couple of years have been promising, it's been a year and a half, and to my knowledge, it's not like anything has happened like the stuff in Cleveland or even New Year's Day 2022. At the same time, it's been a super low leverage environment. The Rockets, they haven't been trying to win, and everything has been largely catered towards KPJ. He's been the point guard without much competition. He's got the giant double locker in the locker room. His name is called last in pregame lineup introductions. Everything has been sort of geared towards him. And to an extent, I understand it. Even though he's young, he actually is one of the more tenured guys, especially once Eric Gordon left on the current roster. So it's not like they're giving him deference that they aren't to other young players. It's more he's just had a bit longer in the league and with the team relative to guys like Jalen and LP that you've drafted in 2021 and Jabari and Tari last year. But look, there hasn't been that much pressure. Steven Silas is a fairly laid back coach. And because you're not trying to really maximize every margin, it's not like, well, if KPJ misses a rotation defensively, or if, he went viral a couple of times putting his hands on his hips and sort of checking out of a possession Harden style when he didn't have the ball in the half court. It's not like Steven Silas was going to yank him from the game on the spot for that type of thing, because the pressure just is not there. The expectations weren't there to win that much. Starting next season with Ime Udoka, that changes. The expectation is there to win. So how is he going to respond to a coach that's more in your face, that gives him more tough love? How is he going to respond when he's not the starting point guard, when there's an uncertain role, when things aren't handed to him? We may not have the double locker. He may not be the last guy called in the starting lineup intros, if he's in the starting lineup at all. That's a fair question. If Kevin Porter Jr. can go out there and accept these changes without having any issues, then it's going to be all the easier, I think, next offseason, be it the Rockets or any other team that might want to trade for him, to look at Kevin Porter Jr. just based on the numbers and say, you know what, this is a really talented young player who's an efficient scorer. If we talk just about the numbers, Kevin Porter Jr. is a desirable guy right now. But the reason he's such a lightning rod, both within the Rockets fan community and in terms of the way players around, and not just players, I should say media types around the NBA evaluate him, no one knows if they can really trust him. And so that's why you see some people that look more at the numbers and say, wow, the Rockets got a steal in that KPJ contract. There's other people that still won't touch him based on some of the past baggage. And I think to this point, again, he shed some of it. The fact he's improved. I know he's taken the anger management stuff in particular seriously. He's done a lot of personal work. And to this point, it seems like it's paying off. That's a really good sign. But again, it's paid off in sort of a certain construct. Now, what you want to see is whether he can take that growth and it still applies, even if things are a bit more difficult on him in terms of the situation, the role. If it does, then yeah, it's going to be a lot easier for the Rockets or any team interested in acquiring him, trading for him, because at $20 million a year or close to it, he could be a very valuable trade piece in terms of tradable salary down the road for the Rockets as well. The bottom line is if KPJ can flourish under Ime Udoka and these changes, then I think this time a year from now, it's going to be much easier to say, hey, that stuff in Cleveland, that really is in the past. And so we can truly judge Kevin based on the production and not have the questions of, yeah, but how is he going to react to this? What's his attitude going to be if so-and-so happens? If KPJ can survive this year and adapt to these changes, again, it's sort of like the Jalen question in a different way. With Jalen, you want to see the numbers improve. You feel pretty good about the attitude. It's more about just seeing the growth in the numbers and the defensive intensity. With KPJ, it's more like, okay, the numbers are there, but let's see what happens in terms of these changes on the team, and does it affect all the growth he's shown personally the last couple of years? If it doesn't, then by next offseason, even though, again, he's year 5, it's not like this is a year where you expect to see a ton of basketball growth from KPJ. You still can. It's not like he's a finished product, but it's not like you're seeing the same growth you would from year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3, year 3 to year 4. It's not quite like that. You are closer to your peak. But I just think based on the unique circumstances and the mental side of Kevin Porter Jr., this is a really big year for him. And if he can come through with all these changes, then all of a sudden next summer, he could be a much more desirable commodity, both for the Rockets and other teams. Finally, number 1 on my list, Jalen Green. It's obvious. I don't need to spend much time on it. We laid out the reasons earlier. There's a lot of talk out there about whether he's a winning player or not. And I think there's perfectly valid reasons as to why he has not come through on some of the metrics to this point, and why it's likely to change when he's used in a different way by Ime Udoka relative to Steven Silas. Now it's on Jalen to show it. It's that simple. We already talked about why. I just think that with Jalen in particular, the dynamics are similar to Sengun in terms of by next offseason, you have to decide on whether you're going to offer him a contract extension, how much, and so on and so forth. It's true with any year 3 prospect. But it's even more impactful with Jalen because of the investment cost. With Sengun, he was number 16 overall pick. With Jalen, he's a number 2 overall pick. So that's why I have Jalen ahead of Sengun. It's just the dynamics are similar in terms of the contracts, the ages, the year 3 factor. But with Jalen, you invested more in him than anyone else in the organization in terms of number 2 overall draft pick in what's turned out to be a very strong 2021 draft class. Cade Cunningham, Evan Mobley, Scotty Barnes. To this point, Mobley picked right behind Jalen has clearly been better. Again, I think there's some extenuating circumstances. There's reasons to believe that Jalen, used in a different way and with better supporting pieces around him, can be a lot better and take the jump. Well, now it's on him to do it. And the final point I'll throw out there for Jalen, if he's still somewhat of an empty calorie scorer, it's not unforeseeable that there's a scenario where Kevin Porter Jr. on a super team friendly contract with a fairly similar body type, player archetype, still very young himself, it's not implausible that if Kevin Porter Jr. goes out and has a very good year and Jalen Green still looks to be something of an empty calories volume scorer, that all of a sudden the Rockets look at Jalen potentially as a trade chip that you could see next summer what you get for him on the trade market. Again, peak value is if you trade a guy after year 3 and the acquiring team gets the player on the remainder of his rookie deal, plus you have full control over whatever you do with that second contract. I'm not saying I expect that scenario. I definitely do not personally, but I do think you have to keep at least a small sliver of an open mind to at least the idea that, look, with Kevin and Jalen, there is a certain overlap in skill set. That's part of why I think a lot of us have been sort of down on KPJ this offseason, is that even though he's a talented player, it's tough to see exactly where he fits in. Will he accept being a 6-man? He's not going to be the point guard with Fred VanVleet, and he and Jalen are both 2 guards. And now it looks like Dylan Brooks is going to be entrenched as your small forward guy, bringing the 3 and especially D, the defensive intensity. So people have been down on Kevin Porter Jr., despite the fact that statistically he was more efficient than Jalen Green this past year. And I think, tiebreaker is going to go to Jalen. You invested more in him. You trust him more. There's less baggage. All of that is true. And my strong suspicion is that Jalen has a strong year 3. And we're not talking about anything next offseason other than, are the Rockets offering Jalen the max or something close to it? And the debate is resolved because Jalen goes out there and plays at a level that's, quite frankly, sounds very similar to what he's already doing right now with the Team USA select team. But if he doesn't, if for whatever reason Jalen doesn't take the leap this year, and the Rockets have another 6'6" guard with similar skills on a very team-friendly deal, it's not unfathomable to where then you start shopping Jalen because he'd be the most attractive trade asset you have, particularly given his age and contractual status and all the control, and basically say, look, we've got a cheaper, more efficient in-house solution in Kevin Porter Jr. Not saying I expect that to happen. Again, I personally don't. But that's what's at stake for Jalen Green this year. If he goes out and plays really well, then he's going to secure himself as the star. He's going to be the focal point of your future, the same way we've envisioned since the moment he was drafted in July of 2021. But conversely, if he doesn't, if he falls short, in my opinion, there's absolutely a world where next summer the Rockets aren't sold on exactly what they're going to offer him in terms of an extension, and maybe they even look at trade possibilities because you have an internal replacement who's not that different in terms of his profile and his talent base. So the point is, there's a lot of variability, there's a lot of volatility. Ultimately, I'm a believer in Jalen. I think he's going to take that leap, but he's at number 1 on my list of guys that this season is most important for, because we can say all the reasons about why this should happen, why we expect it to happen, but it's on him to actually go out there and make it happen. I have confidence that he will, but he's got to do it. It's on him. He's gotten off on the right foot, and now he's got to continue that going into training camp and beyond. So I know I was long-winded there, but again, that's sort of a broad question. That's my top 5: Dylan, Jabari, Alp, KPJ, and Jalen, with Jalen at number 1. Paulo, what's your list?
Yeah, so I think only one we got in the same spot is Jalen at number 1.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, so for the same reasons you listed, I don't have any of the vets in my top 5. Even Dylan Brooks, while I do think it's a big deal for the perception of him around the league, I think for his career overall and the trajectory of his career, it's mostly set in stone. He has a 4-year contract and it's all guaranteed, so I don't think there's much risk for him. I do think that, as I said, from my perception around the league, that it could be a big year, especially if, the Rockets become relevant again and he's somewhat holding them back with his shot selection or whatever. It could become a narrative again. But other than that, I don't have any of the vets in my top 5. So starting by 5th, I actually have KPJ 5th. I think at this point, whether it is under this contract or not, I think it's fairly likely that KPJ sticks around the league going forward. He has something that, he was just as wildly misused by Silas as any other player on this team. He was also given too much responsibility. He was, also one of the focal points of the offense, and as the lead ball handler every single night, he had a lot of responsibility. He was also, forced into a shot creation role, which is adequate for him, but very little of it, or very little percentage of his shots were actually catch and shoot, which is what he thrives at. And so because of that, I think he was good enough last year that I think if the Rockets waived him right now, he could get the MLE with some other team.
Yeah.
So
The way I would put it with KPJ, a year ago, there were still a few questions about whether he would even be an NBA player based on some of the baggage and the stuff we've referenced ad nauseum in this episode and plenty in our archives. The concerns are real. As recently as a year ago, certainly early 2022, after the New Year's Day storming out incident, some people question if he could stick in the league at all. I think at this point, he's shown enough maturity and enough talent and consistency that, yeah, he's going to stay. There's clearly a role. It's just now about, can he, beyond just simply stay in the league and have value, can he be consistent enough on and off the court to be trustworthy for a winning team? To me, that's the variability with KPJ.
yeah, so I kind of have him 5th because from his standpoint, right, I think he's already guaranteed that he's going to be in the league. And so I don't think the upside for him, as far as contracts go, if you were a free agent right now, I don't think the upside would be as high as any of the guys that I have listed above him. And I also think the downside is kind of mitigated compared to the guys I have above him because I think he's more of a known quantity. So from his perspective, I think that is a lot riding on this season. He could still prove to be a starter somewhere. He could be a 6-man. I would bet on most teams in the league. But he could also fall off and just be a guy that lingers around rosters. As a microwave scorer off the bench, kind of like Lou Williams did in the later years of his career after, he wasn't on the Clippers anymore. So I have KPJ there. I considered putting Amen Thompson there as the 5th just because we haven't seen him play like actual NBA level, or compared to most prospects, I think most people would say the overtime elite is worse than college. It's worse than the G League. Right, and so just because we haven't seen him in the two more traditional, even though the G League is not really traditional, but since we haven't seen him in the more traditional league, I think there's a lot riding on his rookie season, as far as what the perception of him is going to be. And we've seen with young players a lot of the time, your first impression is the one that lasts basically throughout your entire rookie deal, or at the very least until you're on a winning team again, which for most guys that are picked at the top of the first round, they don't get to winning teams for a while. Which is why, a guy like Paulo Banchero, the first 3 months of the season really left a mark on people, and people thought that he carried that out throughout the entire year, even though he didn't. Versus a guy like Jalen Green, who was, terrible for the first 3 months and then was actually really awesome for the rest of his rookie season. People kind of forgot about that, and it just kind of slotted him into an archetype, and into a narrative, and he won't be able to get out of it until he is on a winning team. So I ended up, leaving Amen off of it because he's going to come off the bench more than likely, because there's really not much pressure. I mean, he could, come in and just not be good enough or to even earn minutes and go to the G League for a year or whatever it is. But ultimately, he's on the first year of his rookie deal. there's a lot, even if this year goes wrong, there's a lot more years to come. And so from a career perspective, from his perspective, I don't think there's a lot, obviously there's a lot riding on the season, but not as much as KPJ. Fourth, I actually have Cam Whitmore, which kind of contradicts what I just said.
Interesting. Okay, I'll hear you out.
I have Cam Whitmore because I think he fell in the first round, right? So he kind of lost the rights or the benefits of being a top first round pick, which is you're going to get reps no matter what with the main team because the team invested a top pick into you, even if you're not good enough. Prime example is Jalen Suggs, who's been god awful for the first 2 years, but he's still going to get minutes with the main squad because it was a huge investment by the team, and they're going to have to want to take something out of it. The problem with Cam Whitmore is that even though he has the talent to be a top 10 pick, a top 5 pick perhaps, he fell to the 20s, which means that from a team perspective, it's not out of the question that he spend the season in the G League. And if he spends a season in the G League, all of a sudden, a lot of that, how many people or how much will it be reminded, how much pressure will be put in the front office to remind them that he was projected to be a top 5 pick a year ago if he spends a full season in the G League. And if you spend a full season in the G League, you're only a bad shooting season away from being a project. And a guy that everybody qualifies right now as someone who shouldn't have fell in a year with a season in the G League could be, just a project not that different from what Usman Garuba or Josh Christopher were for the time they spent in the G League. Guys that, obviously Cam Whitmore will be above that just from a talent perspective, but it's not too far-fetched to see a world where he's not good enough in training camp, so he spends the year in the G League, and he spends the year in the G League, and he's actually not that impressive. Maybe a parallel to this would be Josh Primo, who was the 11th pick, and he spent a year and obviously he had problems, personal problems aside, but he never really stuck in the NBA, and the Spurs were not in a position to fight for the playoffs or anything at all, but he still didn't get the playing time. And so for Cam Whitmore, earning that playing time, and if he does go to the G League, playing well in the G League is going to be a huge deal for his career moving forward, because he already fell once. I don't think I would hope that he would get minutes with the main team. If it were up to me, he probably would. But a lot is riding on his career, because it's really easy. When people don't get to watch you play basketball at the NBA level, you rise and fall as far as public perception and as far as what I'm not obviously not in the room, but as far as what the league thinks of you, really easily. And that's why sometimes it goes back to the argument that we made in earlier episodes, where is it better to play in the league and be terrible or not, or be injured? Well, worse than both of those is when you play in the G League and you might not meet expectations. So when you're not playing the NBA and you're not injured, it's your valuation shifts a lot. It's a lot more volatile, in my opinion. So I have him fourth. Third, I have Jabari, just because, listen, it doesn't take much for Jabari to stick around in the league for a long time. But at this point, we saw, the brightest of flashes in Summer League, but we still haven't seen a version of Jabari that's even a half-decent NBA player in the NBA yet. And so this season is going to be huge for him to, hey, can you at least provide value as a 3-and-D role player before we worry about any shot creation, before we worry about small ball 5, before we worry about anything else? Can you be a 3-and-D wing? Can you knock down your open threes, which you didn't last season? Can you, stay under control on defense and not be overzealous at times? What did you put on weight to be able to maybe face some tougher matchups? A lot is going to be riding on Jabari, because just like Jalen Suggs, he can go from one terrible year to 2 terrible years, and now people were mentioning Jalen Suggs as a trade-up piece for the Orlando Magic. If you thought about if you threw it back to the pick he was, which I believe was 4th 2 years ago, the 4th pick's pretty valuable, especially in a great draft like the 2021 draft was. So it's going to be huge for Jabari, and I don't think it's, perhaps for his career, this is more of a ceiling, or will he be, this is really important to determine whether he can hit, the higher end scenarios of his ceiling or not. Maybe that's what maybe defined this season. and maybe as far as him staying in the league, it's not that big of a deal. But as far as his minutes go, and as far as the perception of him around the league, I think this will be a pretty big season because, hey, not much is expected. You're expected to play defense and knock down threes. If you can at least do that, you're going to be an incredibly valuable player, and we can start talking about the higher end outcomes of you being a shot creator, of you being, a guy that's 6'11" with a basically unguardable jump shot. But a lot is riding on the season for Jabari as well. Number 2, I have Alperen Sengun. Just because players on their third season are always under the microscope. Alperen Sengun, as I've mentioned, plenty on this podcast, has questions about his defense and not just about the level his defense is at right now, but questions about what level can his defense get to, considering his physical limitations. He's not exactly a freak athlete or if have freak measurements as far as his wingspan goes, which is very important for a shot blocker, which is what you expect or what most teams expect out of their centers. And so I think he'll probably get more responsibility than he had last season on offense. I think everybody will be used better under Ime Udoka, but I don't think he'll struggle with more offensive responsibility. I think he's ready for it. He should have gotten it last year. It's mostly going to be, can this team stay afloat with him at the 5? Because the other option is Jock Landale. So that isn't really Jock Landale is good, right? But he's not exactly someone who's going to keep you, I don't think, keep you above water if Sengun's just drowning out there. So it's a big year for him. Third year, as you said, he's as extension eligible next offseason. How is he going to do? A lot, they didn't get Brook Lopez. A lot of responsibility is going to be on him. And Jalen took 1 year to be, slotted into the narrative of he's a shot-chucking shooting guard that can't contribute towards winning. Well, Alperen Sengun was somewhat protected from his, not amongst Rockets Twitter because we are paying attention, but from a national media standpoint, there were so many problems going on with the Rockets that there wasn't really the time to pay attention to the narrative about Sengun, which is because he had low expectations, because he was a not a lottery pick, but right after, it led to a lot of people being surprised because he was contributing. Well, now he's going to be featured, or at the very least, he's going to start on a team that's trying to win, and so a lot of his flaws are going to be put on full display, and seeing how he deals with that is going to be huge because he can go from a fun player on a bad team that people think would do better on a better system quickly to it's just another offensive center that's a microwave scorer that has a lot of post moves but can't hold his own on defense, and because of that his team can stay afloat defensively. And we've seen countless cases of guys like that, and that's not necessarily true for Sengun, and it's not necessarily fair that he get labeled as that this early on. But just like Jalen Green, it's a ruthless league, and if the Rockets are struggling defensively and the signs are pointing to Sengun, the narrative about him will also change, which is partly why I was so in favor of trading him this offseason, because I thought, hey, it's a big gamble, right? I think his value next offseason is going to be probably drastically, if the Rockets are as good as they plan to be or anywhere close. I thought that his value next offseason is either going to be exponentially higher or exponentially lower, and I, was not optimistic about it, and still am not. And so that's why I advocated towards trading him, because this is a big season for Sengun and for the Rockets, who own an asset, or not own, but have an asset like Sengun, in their ranks. And then leading up to number 1, I mean, it has to be Jalen Green. Like Sengun, he, for the same reasons that Sengun was number 2, Jalen's number 1, because he's Sengun, but he's, further along that timeline where he's already been attributed this tag of can contribute to winning, is not a winning type of player. And so he's at the point, and he has more responsibility and more expectation from the front office. So, and he has probably more value on the trade market. So he's at the point where decisions are going to be made about him, more drastic ones. And so he has more responsibility, more is expected of him. And because of that, I have him number one. Extension, the whole 9 years that I just mentioned about Sengun. Same thing applies to Jalen, except he was a higher pick. He already the narrative's already further along with him. There's probably more guys of his archetype out there that you can substitute for him. I mean, one of them on his own team with KPJ. There's how many CJ McCollums, Jordan Clarksons are there out there if Jalen doesn't show what he needs to show this season? There's a lot of them. Malik Beasley's, whatever it is. If Jalen is who we think he is, and I think he is, he's going to set himself apart from those types of players, namely on the defensive end, but also just being more efficient offensively and being able to contribute without the ball in his hands, which is where some of those guys lack. So, yeah, for me, Jalen's clearly number one. So to recap the list, number one is Jalen, number two, Sengun, number three is Jabari, number four is Cam Whitmore, and number five is KPJ.
That's interesting. I think there's multiple ways you can go about ranking that type of list. I think you went about it from slightly different perspectives. For me, I was thinking more in terms of the actual player's development. Whereas I think the way you did it with someone like Whitmore and definitely your rationale for Sengun, while we both had Sengun high, the reasoning was slightly different. It sounds like you were thinking about them not just in terms of their actual development, but also their liquidity, their value potentially down the line. Because of course with Whitmore, if he's in the G League and he has a poor shooting season, then yeah, it doesn't take much for him to be seen as a project, especially if he's at 20. And with Sengun, yeah, there's a case to be made that this year either the value is going to go up a lot or it's going to go down a lot. That it's probably not going to be level. And so there's a bit of a gamble by continuing to sort of play this out. And of course, that could have potentially been used, and I know you've made it in the past, as a rationale to explore trades this offseason. Now that's extremely unlikely to happen since there's no Brook Lopez. It looks like Alperen Sengun, sink or swim, is penciled in for a 30 minutes per game role. But yeah, I think ultimately that's the difference. You went for more of a value-based approach. I looked at it more in terms of the player's individual development. But ultimately, I think we had fairly similar list, and a little bit of difference is good, I think, for just a more balanced discussion anyway that includes more perspectives. Anyway, to wrap up the episode, and Paulo, I kept you in the dark on this. We put our agenda out earlier today, and I mentioned I wanted to do the top 5 rankings. I wanted to talk about Jalen Green with Team USA. And then I said mystery segment X for the end, because I wanted to throw this on you, and I already teased to it in my top 5 rankings. But here's my sort of off the wall. We're in the dead period of the NBA calendar. We're still more than, or I guess we're slightly less than 2 months away from training camp, but it's still a ways away. Who do we think gets the double lockers for the Rockets? Who do we think has their name called last in the starting lineup intros? And I'll give a little bit of background on both of those. So the double lockers in the home locker room, it's a bit of a status symbol. Basically, the way it works, the locker room at Toyota Center, the lockers for players are put together in basically a U. So you enter the room, and then there's one side of the U, it curves around, and you have the, I forget exactly how many, but somewhere, 16 to 18 lockers in total. And then at the two top points of the U are these fancy double lockers that have obviously more room for shoes, for merchandise, for gear, for your food, which a lot of players eat at their lockers. Basically, it's just more space. And it looks like those guys are leading the way. Basically, those lockers are in a spot where it's easy for them to sort of address the room. And so in many ways, it's sort of a status symbol. And when I first started doing Intense Rockets media in the 2010s, and I should clarify, credentialed media, the lockers belonged certainly to James Harden. I forget who had it when I first started doing credentialed stuff in 2014. I'd done a little bit of credential work before then, but my modern era of Rockets coverage started in 2014. And Harden had one. I forget who had the other at that time. But from 2016 onward, it was actually Nene that had the other. And that's interesting because it shows you that it's not just about the player's performance on the court. It's also about a combination of their performance, but also their role and presence in the locker room as a leader. And so I think Nene, even though he was not the second best player on the team by a long shot, he was an important voice that people looked up to. So he had one of those lockers. Chris Paul actually, now there's little ways to work around it. Chris Paul never got a double locker. He let Nene keep his. But what they ended up doing, I think, is during the 2 Chris Paul years, they oftentimes, for luxury tax reasons were a man short on the roster. And so they would keep an empty locker next to Chris. And so effectively giving him a second locker in case he wanted it. But it wasn't like he had one of the high profile. It was still James and Nene. Then in 2019, it became James and Russ. That was when Nene basically left the team after the 2019 season. And then actually not sure what happened the next 2 years, because the next 2 years, the start of this rebuild with the COVID restrictions, media was not allowed in locker rooms. Basically, no one was as part of the protocols. And so this year being the first year that things are, this past season, truly back to normal, it started out being Kevin Porter Jr. and Eric Gordon. And then it became Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green, with Jalen Green taking EG's locker once he was traded at the deadline. And it became this huge topic of discussion on Twitter. People saying, are the Rockets catering to KPJ too much based on the locker, based on his name being last in intros? Honestly, some of it is because amongst the young players, he was the one that was there the longest. He's been there since January of 2021. The only guy that was there longer was KJ Martin, and he just was not nearly the same in terms of long-term potential or his fit within the core. I know you can point to guys like Jalen and LP, but they arrived later than KPJ. And so KPJ having a bit more experience in the NBA and more with the Rockets, I think that's why he was slightly ahead in terms of the pedigree to get one of those special lockers. And so he had one. And by the end of last season, Jalen had one. And so going into this, I suppose, off season and start of training camp in October, they are the guys who currently have those lockers. However, things have changed a lot. Now you have a new coaching staff in Ime Udoka. They've clearly prioritized veterans, Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks. As far as the lineups, we don't even know if KPJ is going to start. There's definitely scenarios. I'd say it's probably more likely than not that he doesn't. My expectation of the starting lineup at this point in time is Fred, Jalen, Dylan, Jabari, and Alperen Sengun in the middle, with a slight chance that maybe Tari beats out Jabari, although I think after Summer League, Jabari is on much more level footing to retain that job. That's my guess at the starting lineup. So in terms of projecting who goes last, look, we don't even know for sure who's going to be in the starting lineup. And we should also throw out the caveat that while most teams in the NBA finish their starting lineup with the guy that is most highly touted. Think back to the 90s when Matt Thomas would build to a crescendo of Hakeem, the Dream, oh, Olajuwon. There are some exceptions to that. Tiago Splitter, for example, who now is actually an assistant coach for the Rockets, was actually the last guy introduced in the 2014 lineups for the championship Spurs team. But that's a bit of an exception because those Spurs were just, Tim Duncan, Kawhi Leonard clearly did not like the attention. Manu Ginobili, who was perhaps the second best player to Tim throughout that Spurs dynasty, typically came off the bench. So the starting lineup for the Spurs was always a bit different based on the combination of guys who just didn't want the attention. Also, Kawhi didn't really break out the true superstar status until 2016 and after anyway. And it was just sort of like a team construct. Let's just go out and go power forward or point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center, and wrap it up. Most teams, they build to that crescendo. They want their star, the guy with the most juice, last. And it rubbed people the wrong way this past year. That was Kevin Porter Jr. It led into some of those questions of, are the Rockets prioritizing and catering to KPJ too much, and so on and so forth. But again, I think some of it was the Rockets viewed internally. Well, I think it's a combination of one, that they viewed internally that all these guys are on fairly similar footing in terms of young guys just trying to find their way in the NBA, didn't want to give anyone too much too fast. And then some of it is the players sorting it out amongst themselves. And if these guys are talking about it in the locker room, then they may be a bit deferential. Guys like Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun, just someone in KPJ that's been around for a year or two longer than they have. So ultimately, I don't think it was as big of a deal as some made it, but it's an interesting talking point heading into the dead period of the NBA calendar. So there's multiple ways that you could go about it. You could keep the status quo with the lockers as they are, and Kevin Porter Jr. stays last if he's in the starting lineup, or I suppose if he's not, then flip it to Jalen, who's probably the second most tenured. What I think actually happens, and again, this is for fun, this is not meant to make this out to be super serious. I actually think it's going to be Fred VanVleet and either Dylan Brooks or Jeff Green. Probably Dylan Brooks based on the investment cost. Slight chance that they give it to Jeff as sort of a Nene elder statesman role. I think Fred and Jeff or Fred and Dylan are the two double locker guys because you're bringing in veterans for a reason to make them the tone setter. And then by doing that, you're not having to decide between Jalen and KPJ. I think the obvious one would be to say, look, Fred VanVleet is a borderline all-star level player. He has been an all-star in the past. He's won an NBA championship. He's going to get paid up to $130 million over as much as 3 years. So he's got to have one of those leadership roles in the locker room and the double locker that accompanies it. So you could just sort of give KPJ's locker to Fred and move on. Basically, Fred's your point guard now. KPJ is going to be in some different role, and then the band moves on. However, I'm not sure if the Rockets want to try and distinguish between KPJ and Jalen. To me, the cleanest thing might actually be to defer to the veterans, have KPJ and Jalen go back to normal lockers just like everybody else, and just sort of say, hey, these are our tone setters, Fred and Dylan or Fred and Jeff. Let's defer to them, and then all the young guys are basically on a similar playing field. That's my guess as to how they handle it. And then the starting lineup, I think it's got to be Fred. I know he's not James Harden. I know his name doesn't pop to that extent, but this is not Eric Gordon. This is not someone who's just sort of there. This is a veteran who's being paid at a max level because you actually do believe in him, even if it's short term, as a centerpiece for the time that he is with the organization. So my guess is that Fred is the last name called out in the intros. Also, he's one of the few guys that 100% is going to be in that lineup. The others, there's a little bit of risk because you don't know 100% that really anybody outside of Fred is for sure going to be in the starting lineup. And then with the locker room dynamic, I'm going to guess they go with the veterans simply because rather than try and choose between the young guys, I think the young guys just sort of come to a conclusion. Maybe the coaching staff steers them in this direction as well, that, hey, we're all trying to prove ourselves. We're all on fairly level footing. Let's give some deference to the veterans that we brought in here. They're going to lead the way. Let's put them in the higher profile spots and let's follow. And if Jalen proves worthy of that bigger locker in a year or two, then they can revisit the situation then. But I think for now, based on where they are, I think they defer to veterans. And so I'm going to guess Fred and Dylan with the double lockers and Fred with his name called last in intros. How about you?
I'm going to go a little bit spicier. Although
Okay.
I do think what you said makes sense, right? If they want to just tiptoe around the decision. We've seen that KPJ get a little upset over changing his locker, although to be fair to him, I think in Cleveland, like his locker, he got mad because I think in Cleveland the lockers are split and there's a main locker room section and there's a secondary one, and he was being moved to the secondary one. Right.
Yeah.
So I think
Well, I think honestly what happened there, he was just in a bad mental space. It wasn't just that. There were a number of things that were happening both on and off the court. So I think this will be much more smooth simply because he seems to be in a much better headspace now than he was 3 years ago when all that was going on.
So if they do think that, then I actually think, well, it makes sense to not want to make that decision right now and not ruffle any feathers and just give it to two vets. I'm actually going to say that Jalen gets one and Fred VanVleet gets the other, because then if you think he's ready and if he's, open-minded about, coming off the bench and everything like that and doing whatever it takes to win, then you take advantage of the fact that he's open-minded like that and you make the change now rather than asking him to, come off the bench now and then next year asking him, hey, can you give up your locker, or, Jalen's going to take your old locker or whatever it is. I think it kind of makes sense to just rip the band-aid off and ask him to be okay with it, and it's one less thing you got to worry about, although I highly doubt that they worry about it. So I think it's going to be Jalen and Fred VanVleet. I think Fred and Dylan Brooks would make sense. I think Fred and Jeff Green would make sense. I think Fred's the one who walked in, but I think they'll give it to Jalen just because, he has the most responsibility on this team going forward. And I think they probably want him to own up to that responsibility. And Fred VanVleet has talked about, after getting signed by the Rockets, how Jalen, is preparing to take on more of a leadership role. I think as, the years go by and eventually Fred may not be here, I think Tyrese and Jabari Smith are two guys that are, primed to take on roles like that as we move into contention. But for now, I'll go with Jalen and VanVleet. As far as the last name called, my answer would get swayed by whose name got called last in Toronto. Was it Siakam or was it Fred VanVleet? Because if it was Siakam, then I'm going to say that Jalen probably gets his name called.
I'm gonna guess it was Siakam. I don't know that, but the reason I'm guessing is that Siakam was a starter before Fred was. Keep in mind, Fred came off the bench
I know.
for that championship team.
Yep, I remember that. So
I'm gonna guess Siakam.
I'm going to go with Jalen here.
Okay.
Although
It's
it
not
would
like
make
Fred's entitled to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, but I do think Fred's the main leader on this team. I just think, from an optics perspective, from the outside, Jalen is the guy on this team for what it's worth, and with that come
Yeah.
the bad things, but the good things should also come with it. Hey, if I'm going to be the one facing the narrative and facing the critics from the outside most of the time, then you should also get a little bit of extra shine for being what most people consider to be the most important player on the team. So I'm going to go with Jalen for the last name called. Also because from a personality perspective, I think Jalen fits that a little bit more than Fred VanVleet. He's more flashy, more even though he can look shy at times, especially when people ask him to talk. I think he embraces that type of stuff a little bit more. So I think I think it'll be kind of a message that they send to the locker room as well, right? Because up to this point, they gave all of this to KPJ, but everybody knew that Jalen was the most important player on the team. And so maybe they take this opportunity to show, hey, we expect this to be Jalen's team, and if he doesn't step up to the plate, then they can also use it as, hey, this is what happens when you don't meet expectations, and they may change it next year depending on how the season goes. But I think, giving that responsibility to what most people consider to be our franchise player would make sense.
Yeah, I think some of this may also depend on how much the organization wants to get involved, because the way it's been described to me when I've actually asked about this, not that any of it's a huge deal, but it does at least reflect the thought processes used, is that it's not like the organization decided that that's the way it's going to be the last couple of years. It was more they were very hands off and let the players decide, and the players ultimately landed on this as the arrangement. And the organization sort of took the mindset of it's largely harmless. And of course, the last couple of years, it's not like they were trying to win anyway. So let's just let them play out as they see fit. As opposed to now, expectations are higher. And of course, there's a new coaching staff led by Ime Udoka. Maybe he does want to set a tone and, while not decide everything himself, have a bit more of an active role and nudge them in a certain direction. The reason I think KPJ, as mentioned earlier, was given a lot of deference the last couple of years is that he had a bit more experience relative to those other young guys. So he was slightly ahead of them in the pecking order, simply in terms of how they viewed each other, all being relatively young in the NBA. But organizationally, yeah, you make a good point. Jalen's certainly the guy they have the most invested in. He's the centerpiece of the franchise right now. Maybe you take this as a point to an opportunity to hammer that home and put him in a spot where, if he develops the way you expect him to, it's not like you have to then carve out a locker for him in a year or change the way it's introduced. Maybe you just show you believe in him right now and dive headfirst into that. And again, it's not that I think it's that serious, and it's not like it should be priority one or even close to one for Ime Udoka. This is way, way down the list, but it's fun to talk about. And I ultimately think that some of it, my guess on them leaning to veterans is if it stays similar to the last couple of years and they let the players sort of decide it amongst themselves. And my guess is that even though Fred and Dylan are newcomers, Jeff as well, the team has been so bad here in Houston, I think they'll be somewhat deferential to those guys simply based on having won in other situations. And it may be that Ime has a different approach and comes at it from a different perspective. So we'll have to wait and see. I think you're taking the more Ime friendly view of things, or maybe not Ime friendly, but the more Ime heavy view of things, that he has more of a role. And my guess is if the players, the way they did the last couple of years, basically sorted out amongst themselves. Interesting to follow. Don't think it's ultimately that meaningful, but it may tell you a little bit about how hands-on or off the Ime Udoka administration is for the Rockets. Paulo, before we close out, anything else you want to throw out?
Yeah, I want to ask. I'm not sure how the Astros clubhouse is. I doubt there's a double locker. But if they have the Rockets locker room, it's obviously Altuve, right? But I'm asking, Who gets the second one? Does JV get it back
So
since he
yeah,
got traded for?
I'm actually interested to see. I'm going to do a few Astros games as credential media in early September. I haven't done any this year. JV had the biggest one. There's no double lockers, but they do have corner lockers. They might be a little bit bigger, but the main thing is the corner so that you sort of have that extra space as well. And so JV was the one that was notorious based on his pedigree for having the biggest. Alex Bregman had another. The thing about Altuve, he's so low maintenance. Like he is the most low maintenance superstar that I've ever seen in sports, which of course is just hilarious to think about with how much vitriol he gets from other fan bases. Of course, that's misguided, but the vitriol he gets, you would think that he's some prima donna with a huge ego that everybody hates. No, not at all. He's super selfless. Like, not that somebody who wants a big locker is high maintenance, but I do think that Altuve is such that it's just not a big deal to him at all. And other guys, not that it's a huge deal to them, but I don't know. They're just a little more vocal. So yeah, like last year, Verlander, Bregman, Correa before he left had one of them. I forget who ended up taking. Actually, I think Altuve might have. Don't quote me on this. Altuve might have ended up taking Correa's. But it's noteworthy that even though Correa came up after Altuve and Bregman did as well, they ended up ahead of Altuve, sort of in that pecking order. I think more just because. I mean, Paulo, you have to see it watching the games. They're just more sort of vocal in that way. Altuve's very easygoing, very pliable. Guys like Correa and Bregman are a bit more outspoken.
What about? I guess my next two on the list would be probably Uncle Mike and
Yeah,
Lance.
yeah,
Although
you're
I'm
right. Yeah,
guessing
you're right. I
Lance
forgot.
isn't
Yep,
there a
that's it.
lot.
Yeah, no, you're right. Brantley has a corner. That's who I wasn't thinking of. Yeah, Brantley has a corner, and Fromber has one as well, I believe. There's almost
Wait,
a
how many corners are there?
well, yeah, there's like four. Yeah, it's different or shoot, there's more. No. The way it's set up, there's like six actually in the Astros
Oh,
locker
I
room
thought there
because
was
it's more.
two. I was like,
No. There's the way it's set up. There's six. It's not a U. Like there's breaks in the U. As far as it's more of like an oval with some break points that go into like hallways or different places. So yeah, the Astros have like 5 or 6. It's not like the Rockets where there's normally just two. Now there might be a way that you can give somebody an extra locker, but there's only two that are actual like big lockers in primo locations. And one final note I should point out about the Astros, I was like, yeah, Verlander, Correa, Brantley, they're more vocal types. Everybody knows Brantley after game 3, I believe, of the World Series is when, even though he wasn't playing, he lit into them, and that was the turning point in the World Series. Paulo, this was before you were a fan, but one thing that really stood out to me about Alex Bregman in 2017 and 2018, when the Rockets had a lot of Spanish first speakers in the clubhouse, Bregman actually took Spanish lessons himself so that he could communicate with guys like, obviously Yuli Gurriel was his infield mate. That was most noteworthy. Correa spoke English well, but I think he was a Spanish first speaker. And so Bregman, to sort of make himself on the best terms, and Bregman actually came up last of all of them. Altuve, a native Spanish speaker as well. Bregman came up in 2016. And so even though he was number 2 overall draft pick, even though he had all this high profile status, American star, LSU top pick or number 2 overall pick, he still went the extra mile because so many of his teammates, especially the guys he works closely with in the infield, were Spanish first speakers. Bregman went the extra mile while playing professional baseball to learn Spanish. And so that's, I know this is a basketball podcast, but I think that speaks well to Alex Bregman, the person. And I think that speaks as to why he has one of those corner lockers, because he does value being a guy that can sort of not just do his own job, but try and support his teammates as well. And so I think that's why, even if Bregman isn't the type of raw guy that you think of with like Verlander, Brantley, Correa when he was here, but I do think he's low key someone who tries to make life better in the clubhouse for his teammates. And that can be something that sort of goes into those decisions as well. Anyway, I think we've had enough baseball talk for one episode. Don't want to do too much because, hey, we've got 2 more months before the NBA fully returns. I know we'll have some World Cup games and whatnot. We'll also have some schedule reaction once that drops later this month. But it's a slow time. Of course, we'll have some interviews in there as well. But for episodes that's just Paulo and myself, yeah, we may need to sprinkle in some baseball talk here or there, maybe some football talk as well. CJ Stroud starting for the Texans in their preseason opener on Thursday night, so maybe we'll have some excitement out on the gridiron as well. Time will tell. At least we hope we will, because again, there's still 2 long months to go. Rockets already sort of shot off their fireworks with the free agency signings and trades in late June, early July. Now we're just waiting until October to see those pieces on the floor. Anyway, we've talked enough for one episode, so we'll bring it to a close right here. For Paulo, I'm Ben. If you want more content from either of us before our next episode, the best place to get it is on Twitter, or I suppose on X. Paulo is on there at Paulo Alves NBA, simply his name and then NBA. I'm on there at Ben DuBose, and the show is on there at The Logger Line. If you go to that handle on Twitter/X, you can find your link tree, which has links to not just our distributors, places like Apple, Google, Spotify, that you can listen to this podcast, but also our partners, sponsors, and friends, Sports Talk 790, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Karbach Brewing, where this show is put on courtesy of their beer, Clutch City Lager, developed with the Houston Rockets. You just go to our link tree and you can find out how to access all of their content and learn more about everything that they have to offer. And if you take advantage of any of those opportunities, tell them that the Logger Line sent you by. We would definitely appreciate that. Anyway, with the plugs complete, we will adjourn. Again, for Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.